So my colleague tells me that we are on again. Welcome back from coffee and other contributions to the water cycle where you live or work. Where we compared the responses to the question, and actually the result was the typical result when a leading scientist talk about a complex topic. The Paradise Lost forests are generally good for water cycle faction had about 1/3 of the responses before the webinar. It went a bit down to now 11%. We have a few now that think that there's a general blue-green competition, but only very few. But most of you think that it's complicated and depends on the situation, which is probably what was a bit expected before, also by me. This is not a good basis actually for Sven, because it would have been much easier if the outcome would have been very clear in the one or the other way, specifically in the blue lost paradise way. And now it gets even more complicated because now we are a bit moving beyond the water cycle and the ecology towards economics and towards questions of, let's say, land governance from an economics perspective. Sven, we had some technical issues. I think the presentation will be shown by my colleagues, but I hope we can hear you now. I would say the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, good. So thank you very much. Can we get my presentation up, please? My name is Sven Wunder. I'm working for EFI as principal scientist. I'm also still an associate scientist for C4. And the idea was now to go more into the specific element of payments for environmental services as one way to take action to change some of these relationships on the ground. Okay, I think the presentation is up.
Yes, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can still hear
you to put your questions already during the presentation. That makes it easier to start off the discussion. Thank you. Sorry, Sven.
Okay, good. So question is, can these payments for environmental services help to support improved forest management? Next slide, please. So I'm gonna start out with just some basic definition and overall facts about payments for environmental services, or PES. Then I'm going to turn more into Watershed PES, in particular with an example and some scoping. A bit about the evidence, we have for how much impact there is from these watershed PES schemes, and finish up with some brief discussion. Next, please. Okay, starting with the point. Next, please. So just sort of the basic definition that I'm working with PES is that it's voluntary transactions that have between some well-defined service users and service providers, with some conditionality involved vis-a-vis some agreed rules of natural resource management, typically a contract between those two parties. And those contracts are typically made for around some off-site services. There's some spatial element in the contract. So this is no, not yet. This is a narrow definition, and other definitions are out there. For instance, mine is using a slightly different and more inclusive definition. Next, please. So where has this stuff been used? I think carbon and watersheds are the two environmental services where a lot have been done, a bit in biodiversity and landscape beauty and landscape aesthetics. There are basically two types. There's one where the users are paying directly, or there's one where the government is stepping in on behalf of the users and paying, typically in larger schemes. So there are more of these small-scale schemes, but in in turn there's more money and hectares and people involved in the government schemes. A lot of them have been in the Americas, in South and North, a bit in Asia and in Europe, and probably less in Africa. And for instance, in Latin America, it's very much the watershed element that has been in the forefront. So municipal water utility companies or hydroelectrical power plants interested in reducing the siltation of their dams, etc., have been keen to pay. In Europe, the hydrological element has also been present in some of the agro-environmental schemes, and one of the sort of poster child PES schemes is the Vitel scheme in France, although it's more around the type of agriculture than around forests. Next, please. So what about the preconditions? Are there places where we cannot use PES? I think first argument is, well, in some cases, providing the environmental services may be too expensive, and converting land uses or doing other things with the landscapes may be more profitable. That's a basic precondition. A second one is that the buyers kind of have to, when there is an economic argument, they still have to be able to organize themselves to pay, because there could be water users for them, makes sense for them, but they can't get their act together to organize a payment. They are free riding each one on their own. And although it would be in their economic interest to try to set that up. And the third one is around, on the provider side, it's around the land tenure conditions, where often, especially in the tropics, you have cases where smallholders and communities do not only not have formal land tenure, but actually they don't have exclusion rights, so people can come and occupy their land or extract resources from there. Then they can't be effective service providers. So that's a key thing in the agricultural frontier, for instance. And that also means that PES is often less suited to what are sort of the low income, poor governance regions, where those preconditions don't hold. Next, please. I was trying to look a little bit in my sort of PES database, just a back of the envelope calculation. You know, what are the changes in the landscape that are typically being paid for in those schemes that I know, and by the vast majority is about forest conservation. So in the upper left corner. Some of it is about retiring agricultural lands. So those are the use restricting, where you actually restrict economic activities. And then on the right-hand side, you have the use modifying things, afforestation, reforestation, clean development mechanism, etc. Some of those are in there, and a few of them are in kind of improved agriculture as well. But notably, we were interested also in forest management and sustainable forest management. Actually, I could not find any such schemes, and asked also mine and other people about it. We could not really identify a PES scheme that has that focus. Next, please. And why is that? Why is there not any PES for a management scheme? Well, I can only speculate about that, but a few points are, well, is the difference in environmental services big enough? And is it certain enough? Is it well consolidated by scientific evidence so that it's clear that there is an important additionality? I think for conserving forest, for instance, for clean water, etc., you do have the a record, a scientific record that is the case, and there can be a significant difference, although with the caveats that Maynard also mentioned in his presentation. The second thing is sustainable forest management involves a whole number of activities. Can we actually monitor those easily and in a way that are not very costly? I don't think you always can do that with remote sensing, for instance, and if there at the same time are many small forest owners, then that might become expensive to go and say, well, we verified that you've not done your thinning of the forest as you were supposed to in this quarter, and we can't pay you, we have to pay you less, etc. And that maybe the third thing is that often when you introduce management, it's often supposed to in itself be more profitable than a laissez-faire scenario where you have an abandoned forest. We know that that's not always the case. And we also know that that certification as a tool has been used for sustainable forest management, paying a premium price. So there we do have that element, but it's typically against a backdrop of some unsustainable extraction rather than a backdrop of an abandoned forest or a laissez-faire scenario. Next, please. So the second thing was about the watershed parts. Next, please. So this is kind of the typical setup. You have an upstream community that's doing agriculture, etc. A river that is flowing down. You have a city downstream. And somehow we believe that what the upstream guys are doing in terms of their land use and resource use has some impact on the watershed services. So you decide to try to negotiate some rules. And that's where the PES schemes comes in. Next, please. Next, please. But there could also be some other environmental services involved. For instance, the people from the city could go up into the hills in the weekend and for some ecotourism. For that, we don't need a PES contract because it's not a kind of an externality that is spatial. So you can pay for that directly through your hotel bill, for instance. So that's understanding a little bit how the spatial externality comes into the PES contracts. Next, please. So on the other hand, what kind of watershed services are actually being paid for? I'm citing here from a Bellagio conversation publication that we did collectively. Maine is involved in that as well, and I think it has a lot of practical hints about also how to construct a PES scheme, and I have the reference in the end. But typically, stream flow quantity, the variability, typically seasonal dry flow, it's dry season flow, quality, sediments, nutrients, pollutants, etc. was already mentioned, and risk management. We also discussed floods and landslides, etc. And notably also, as already discussed, there are also some brown elements in there that are typically being bundled up with the environmental services. For instance, not polluting the river with something could be part of that PES scheme. And the sectors involved, as mentioned, hydroelectricals and drinking water are prime sectors. Others could, in principle, have been involved. Irrigation, farmers, downstream fisheries, etc. We don't see that typically, and I think they are not really organized enough to set up PES schemes. And then we have the public payments for watershed schemes, where the watershed part is a bundle of a bigger set of services: carbon, biodiversity, recreational benefits, etc. Next, please. Next, please. Okay. Just to give you one example, one that I know well, it's a small-scale watershed scheme in Pimampiro in northern Ecuador. where you had some high deforestation pressure up in the upper watersheds, and the city decided, we need to protect that, and inspired by the Costa Rican PES schemes, they decided that through the municipal water company, they would make a surcharge of 20% on the water bill, and those funds would be used to pay the community in the upper watersheds to restrict deforestation and let certain areas regenerate. And some institutions involved here are the municipal government, an NGO that helped to set this up, and the community itself. Next, please. And this is what it looks like. Going clockwise, you have the town of Pimampiro, you have the water intake, you have some fragmented landscape with the pastures and agriculture and forests, and some of the primary forest as well. Okay, next please. So how well does this stuff actually work? Next please. So in theory, we would assess these impacts by saying, let's say we have a situation where the watershed services are constant, we want to raise them. So we introduce this PES scheme where we do some contracting about landscape use, and we expect that from then onwards, with those payments, the watershed services rise, and you get an additionality compared to the baseline of what would have happened without such a scheme. So that looks pretty nice. Next one. In practice, you think that the baseline is all but a straight line, and it may look more like this. A lot of fluctuations because if you look at stream flow, for instance, here is the stream flow that we after, because nature is not well behaved. There are lots of factors influencing, starting with the starting with the precipitation. So you have a lot of fluctuations that you maybe need to even out with some averaging, etc. Next, please. So often to really see what happens to the environmental service itself, you need longer term time series, back in time and after the intervention. You may need some controls, for instance, like paired catchment approaches or other sort of cross-sectional approaches to understand, what are the other effects? What about climate change, for instance, and how does that affect the water flow? And how can you separate that out to see what can be attributed to our specific intervention? So in the short run, you may want to monitor land use instead, and somehow model the hydrology part with all the caveats that Maina also mentioned in the Q&A session. Next, please. For that Pimampiro scheme, we actually tried to do some soft impact evaluation. There are some rigorous methods for doing impact evaluation, and the most rigorous one is kind of a randomization approach where, part of the community gets paid and another part does not get paid, and then you compare the two. That's very hard to apply, including because it's a very small scheme, and just for the statistical freedoms of comparison, it's difficult to do that, and it's costly as well. And the second problem is there was a kind of an intervention mix. There was not only a PES scheme, but also some existing command and control rules and some more integrated conservation and development, kind of an ecotourism project, etc. So attributing to what the PES scheme did right or wrong is actually or achieved is quite difficult. We try to do some simple before and after comparison by looking at that about 200 hectares had been cleared before 2000 when the scheme was introduced, and some of that was actually deforestation went down significantly. Some areas also got back into better quality, etc. Then there's the sort of the control issue. what about the other areas around? Actually, a new road was built in that area, and more forest was lost in close by villages. So that kind of sustains a weak argument, at least, that probably this had some additional effects. And if we go beyond of the land use, we did with SIAT in Colombia, we did some soil and water assessment tools of SWOT modeling, which is this kind of a quick hydrological assessment approach, where we made a plausible argument. We think that there was some significantly avoided sediments that would have happened if the deforestation had continued, and that also dry season flow had been incremented. So that means we're going to also actually set some physical amounts of, for instance, sedimentation avoided, and there's some costs related to that in terms of the damage that sedimentation causes to the system. So that gives us an evaluation approach of avoiding them, sort of the sediments, and how much that saves us in terms of money. Next, please. But mostly, you know, the evaluations are at the land use level, and this is a forthcoming article where we sort of compare some of the hard, rigorous evaluated impacts on forests from PES schemes. And I've marked on the right-hand side, I marked with an arrow, you know, the blue ones are the ones that are pure water schemes. The yellow ones are ones that are mixed, sort of bundled services where water is part of it. And you can see you have a couple of ones that are scoring high, and you have also a couple of scenarios where the intervention had very little impact. If we go to the panel on the right-hand side, it's interesting to see that you know, a lot of those areas where you had a previously high deforestation pressures, that's also often where you get a good impact. But a lot of them are implemented in places where the pressure is quite low, maybe in a preventive sort of manner. But there you will obviously, because you're comparing with equally non-threatened areas, you will not get a lot of impact using these kind of methodologies. And how is the PES doing? The last one on the right-hand side bottom, how is PES doing compared to other tools? Well, we don't really have enough observations, and the differences are not that large. But you can see here that the PES stuff is doing fairly well in terms of the impact being slightly more positive than the other ones, at least significantly more positive than the disincentive ones. Next, please. So my ending two slides with some discussion. What can we say about payments for watershed services? I think it's a classical PES setup, because you have some well-defined users and providers of the service, and you have a splendid payment vehicle that just keeps running, which is the water. If you can somehow, if you are paying already for the water, then it's easy, relatively easy to add on an element of payment for a better service related to that water. Second, we can see that most PES watershed schemes are being used for forest conservation, not so much for forest management, maybe because of the size of the environmental services or the monitoring costs. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible to do it, and maybe some of the folks in Sincere are going to be the first ones to pull that off. Third point, in Europe, we do not have a lot of PES schemes, especially not private ones. We do have some public payments, but the private willingness to pay for watershed services has so far at least not been very great. And I think it's often a question of those environmental things, they're being seen as the responsibility of the state. So why should we pay for it? We also pay taxes, etc. And fourth, monitoring what happens to the services itself. It can often be tricky. You need good data. You need time for it. But in terms of the land use effectiveness, we can see that in some cases it has been working very well. But that depends also very much on the area selection and on the design of these interventions. Next, please. My last slide. There were some questions from the sincere partners put up also on payments for watershed services prior to this seminar, and one. Let me take them one by one. Can economic values be quantified for the improved provision of watershed services? As we've seen, it's often hard to do that because also the biophysical things are not secure, and we're operating in ranges perhaps rather than in terms of point estimates. So then the economics becomes, as Georg said, then the economics becomes even harder. But maybe that's also often not necessary. That's precise economic valuation. Because question 2, how could such economic values be converted into monetary incentives? And I would say, well, maybe forget about too much about the valuation of the ecosystem service and focus more your economic assessment on the provision costs. What do landowners have to do to make a change? We feel pretty certain about that it's a good change for us. We'd see how much would it cost them? So how much would we need to pay them to change something? And that gives us a value, and we can see, well, is that worth our while, in terms of the environmental service users considerations. Third one, could payments rely on clearly demonstrated benefits provided? As I said, maybe after 20 years of monitoring, maybe yes. But till then, often you need to do some kind of modeling to make some assumptions about the linkages between the land use and your alleged environmental services in order to see if the thing is working. And the final one, what institutions need to be in place for payments for environmental services? And I can actually not see the last line here. Don't know if you can. But yes, you typically need some conditions about land tenure that need to be safe enough for the exclusion rights. Yes, thank you. You need typically some intermediaries that help you, help you broker this thing between the service users and the service providers. You need safe land tenure on behalf of the service providers, and you need a good payment vehicle that you can tie your payments to in order to make it happen. Let me stop here. Thank you. Maybe in the last slide, we can take that one. That's this practical guide for payments for watershed services from 2008, but I think still very relevant for the things we're discussing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sven, for, again, an interesting presentation. Actually, you answered the questions I had prepared to get us running on your last slide.
Yes.
So I would take the liberty to put 2 other questions, but at the same time, I would really encourage again the participants to put their questions. We have one long question already, but definitely I think there are many questions that now could be asked to you for comments. My first question would be, I would be really interested in knowing, you mentioned that in Europe we have hardly cases of private PES, if I got it right. How's it looking globally? Is it also the state, or state institutions paying mostly, or is it private engagement? Do you have an overview globally?
Yes, so I think in the well, first there's no sort of a recent assessment of all watershed schemes. We do have you know, some data from IID did a survey, but that's some years ago already. Forest Trends is doing some assessments of schemes. There's a little bit out there, but I would say in generally there's much more private willingness to pay in the Americas, where people the states does not play so big a role, and you know that you know, if you want to change anything, you need to do it yourself. Basically, you need to get your act together and put some money on the table to make those changes. That's at least my perception of why these things are more widespread in the Americas, and they're actually really been mushrooming in South America in particular, but also in North America.
Thank you, Sven. I'm just thinking if this is now an advantage or disadvantage, but I think this will be a long discussion. I have a second point, and then Harald Mauser, he has an interesting example of a PES-like case, perhaps, from Vienna. Be prepared, we will give you the floor very soon. But for you, Sven, if I'm a forester or forest owner or forest owning company, and I would be really interested in developing a PES scheme, what sort of 3 steps, 4 steps would you recommend me to do? So I'm there. I have the assumption something good is happening with my forest. Others are benefiting from that. What would you do?
I think the initiative in practice often does not come from the forest owner, but comes more from the forest users. So, of course, I could get all forest owners together and make a nice PowerPoint presentation and get some of Minus data in there and go to the water company and say, hey, we guys are actually delivering clean water to you, and that's in danger because A and B and C, the world is changing, and if it goes in the wrong direction, you could lose your clean water. So you could, but it's typically more the water users that are the strategic elements. They are typically taking the initiative to this and say, hey, there's something wrong here. We need to do something, and why don't we get into dialogue with those forest owners that are upstream?
Thank you, Sven. That's also interesting. I didn't know that. Now I think we give the floor to Harald Mauser, working for FE in Brussels, and he has an interesting case to tell about the Vienna Quellforsten, as far as I know.
Thank you, Georg. Thank you, Sven, for your presentation. Maybe another form of payment for water ecosystem services. The city of Vienna gets its drinking water from its own forests that are located 100 to 200 kilometers away. And forest management there has the provision of high quality drinking water as the first and most important management objective. So it does not use the full wood harvesting potential that would be possible sustainably there. And now the interesting thing is that the water administration within the city government uses some share of the drinking water fees that every citizen has to pay the forest administration within the city government to compensate for the increased cost or the reduced income. And I think this is also a kind of payment for water ecosystem services. It's not very visible. It's an internal transaction, but money is flowing. But I think there are some cities, at least at global level, that have similar circumstances where you also have this kind of payment for water systems, for ecosystem services. Thank you.
Thank you, Harald. Sven, do you want to comment on it?
Yes, I think that sounds very interesting, and it sounds very much like a payments for environmental services scheme to me. And there are probably a lot of cases we don't actually know about because these transactions are not out in the open, and because they have not been analyzed with that angle. I mean, there are also other type of resources flow back to upstream owners. I know, for instance, in Munich, you'd had in some of the upstream areas a certification of some of the milk and other products being produced in a way that was compatible with the watershed goals of the water users. So you can also use other mechanisms that are not PES for getting a sort of a flow back of resources into the upper watersheds.
Thank you, Sven. And
Thank you for the example. Yeah.
And it seems you get also questions via your cell phone while we are in the webinar.
No. Yeah. No.
I would like to soon give the floor to George Kimbova to ask his question in person. But before that, I want to read another question by Teresa, who we had already visible in the webinar. Sven, what is your perception of the future of forest water PES schemes in Europe? Do you think that climate change can trigger the implementation, or are the barriers that you mentioned too big to overcome? So basically, what do you think will happen in the future, looking at climate change, looking at drought events?
So I think it's a good question. I think that in general, sort of the increased water scarcity that we are probably facing because of climate change will raise awareness about these issues. And the question is also if our states will have a capacity to make sure these services are provided. If you have a situation where you move a little bit more towards the Americas, where the state is a bit more retracted, then I think you're also creating more space for those private initiatives or municipal initiatives or regional initiatives. So I could imagine a scenario where PES becomes more popular in Europe as well.
Thank you very much, Sven. So we have George online. George Kimbova, can you shortly say who you are, where you are, and then put your question live?
Yeah, I'm George Kimboa. I'm one of the PhD candidates under the SESAM project that Meina mentioned. I'm currently in Wageningen. Yeah, thanks, Sven, for your presentation. I think it was your second slide, where you mentioned that worldwide, most of the payment for ecosystem services is basically concerned about forest conservation, not necessarily for sustainable forest management. So in my thinking, I thought one leads to the other. So could you clarify on the difference between the two? Thank you.
So with forest conservation, I'm saying mostly restriction of degradation and deforestation, and that means often sort of set aside forests, maybe where some benign uses are being allowed, NTFP, extraction, etc., but typically not timber harvesting and other things. With sustainable forest management, I would typically imagine that timber extraction is allowed, but with certain environmental clauses, and that's not the type of schemes that we've seen rewarded in terms of PES schemes. So, of course, sustainable forest management is a wide-ranging term. People use it differently, but those are the distinctions that I intended to make.
Thank you, Sven, and thank you, George, for putting the question. At the moment, it's rather quiet on the chat, so I would put a question I have since quite some time. I always forgot to ask you, Sven. You're probably one of the most knowledgeable person on PES globally, on the research world. So is there, let's say, this super case where you can learn so many good things from this best practice example that you would recommend to everyone who wants to work on forest-related pests? Or can you not give such, so something where you think this is really, really interesting, working very well, has a lot of effect, has aligned demands and supply? Can you name such a case?
I'm not sure there's really one such scheme. I mean, I'm often using this Pimampiro one because I know it well and because it's been running for a long time. I've not sort of checked up on it very lately on the status, but I mean, for the agricultural part, that's as I'm saying, this Vitel scheme is often being used as a sort of poster child example, but it's pretty special in a way that it's a very high value environmental service because of the spring water that is being used and sort of even a little change in pollution levels sort of could make a lot of difference. So it's a very particular example. No, I think there are various examples out there of forest pest schemes. I wouldn't. I'm not really. I mean, of course, on the public side, the clear example is the Costa Rican scheme. On the sort of public pest scheme is the Costa Rican PSR scheme that has been running since 1996. And I think it's also the fact that many of these things are in pilots and maybe been running for 2 years or 3 years, and that does not really allow you to learn a lot of lessons. For the Costa Rican pest scheme that has been up and running for more than 20 years, you have certainly you can observe changes in the way that it has been handled, in the way that the intervention is being carried out, where you've taken lessons on board and plowed them back into the implementation, and that makes it interesting. So that would be the poster child example for PES, I think.
Thank you, Sven, and you made my colleague Jose here from Communications happy as he's coming to Costa Rica.
Yes.
Thank you. At the moment, I don't see any more questions. So then I would suggest let's move on. We do not need to extend this longer. If there are any questions, and I'm also sure that our speakers are willing to respond to specific questions, either through the question and answer session, or you may also contact them. Well, I shouldn't say this because we didn't ask you before, but I think in urgent cases, you can also contact them, I guess, via email. I would like to then move on to the final stage of our seminar, and we have a last poll and question for you, and I'm really curious about this one now. Jose, can you put it on? Well, now, against the background of what you have been hearing and what you knew before, we would like to ask you, how likely do you think is that a payment for ecosystem or environmental services scheme on forests and water is launched in your region? We have different categories, from it will never happen to it already exists. And we are really curious about your answer. And we give you 30 seconds because it's a bit more response options. Okay, let's give it 5 seconds and then we show the results. Okay. Okay, so we have quite some optimism after the seminar. No one thinks it will never happen. However, 31% thinks it's rather very unlikely. But there is, if I see it correctly, about 1/3 saying it's already existing, so you should connect to Sven about it. And then there's a quite big group, more than 1/3, saying that it's likely happen in the future. So Maine and Sven, there's a lot happening there and a lot of possibilities to support this with your research. I think this is a nice closing of our webinar. There is activity out there on water, forests, and pest systems. Well, and for me, it's time to wrap up. I don't want to go back into the details, and probably even I would not be able to do it of both presentations, because there was so much information, so much interesting information in that I would rather suggest that you share the slides and we make the webinar anyhow available for everyone that wants to go through this again with a bit more time and in a more relaxed mode. It's not on a Friday morning, but rather on a Saturday afternoon or so. But I would really like to thank, first of all, both speakers. Maine, perhaps you can connect to video again, that we can see you, if the line is stable enough. Hello, Maine, once again, and to Sven, you did a great job in, I think, introducing, on one hand, the complexity of the issues we are talking about, but also indicating a bit some directions on both sides. I think more on the ecological research as well as on this really interesting question, how to translate ecological research into concrete governance modes or payment systems. It's very clear to me, I have to say, that it's not this type of webinar where you go out and you have a clear answer to all the pressing questions that you have, especially as a practitioner and a policymaker. But perhaps this is also simply not possible. I think the reality is complex. You have shown this in many ways, and this should not discourage people, however, I think, from trying to innovate at this forest water society interface. But I think what's very clear to me, to do it in this easy way, coming out of that you think it's all great and you just have to work on pest schemes to get paid finally, or the good things our forest is doing, is probably not the way to do it. But the way to do it is to be careful, to really look into what are the interrelations, what do we know, how can models support us, how can measures support us, and to understand this first, but then to go ahead, I would think, and to use the experience that Sven has and on the good examples also to work on such systems. Well, I would like to thank both of you. That was really a great job. But I also would like to thank to the IUCN and my colleagues at EFI that have been working hard in the back to make this possible, and specifically to Kate from IUCN. Kate Rayleigh, can you show yourself? That we can also thank you. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To Sarah Adams from EFIMED. Hello, Sarah. Thanks a lot for delivering all these perfect concept notes to do this, and Kate. And finally, Jose from Costa Rica, that I now have to contact after this webinar and ask him about the pest scheme in his country. Hello, Jose. Thank you very much also to the European Commission for funding the Sincere project, this webinar, but also our work on these interesting questions we have been discussing about, not only for forests and water, but for many more forest-related ecosystem services. And finally, I would really like to thank to all of you for following this on a probably busy Friday morning. I hope it was interesting and rewarding. We received some comments that it was, that we didn't read because we just selected the questions. I hope you join us again in Sincere at another time and on another topic, because we are planning more of these activities throughout the next year in the project. Well, and as I said, presentations and recording will be available. We will share it with you. With that, okay, Sarah's showing up. What did I forget to say?
We were going to repeat the very first poll that we did at the beginning of the webinar. We were going to repeat it at the end. So it's poll number 1, and I can launch it now for you if you'd like to repeat that poll.
Well, I was thinking, yeah, well, let's do it and let's see if you have all become experts to see the learning effect.
It's not this one, hold on, this one.
Okay, so you have a chance to interact. Please, if you now click I don't know anything, then this would be a bit disappointing. But I'm really looking forward to comparing this poll now. You have about 20 seconds.
Mhm.
Okay. Does it look like possible? Okay, so can we compare this with the initial one? So obviously, about 62% say that they know some aspects, 10% are an expert. And if we compare it with what we had before, so the 2% that said, or actually the 1% that said, I don't know anything, has either left the webinar or has learned something. And then there's still a majority that knows some aspects of the topic. I would still make my cross there now, I have to say. But there are more people that think that they know a lot about the topic and they're feeling as expert. And there are much less people that say that they know a little. So I think there was definitely a learning effect. And this goes again to you, Meine and Sven. Thanks for helping with that and making this evaluation result possible. But now I think I have not forgotten anything else, but I look at my colleagues. They are smiling, which is a good sign. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a great weekend, a great evening in Indonesia, and a great Friday afternoon in Europe, and probably morning in the US. Thank you very much. See you next time.